Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to have a lecture on the anatomy of the palate. The palate forms the roof of the oral cavity. The anterior part is called the hard palate because it is formed mainly of bone covered by mucous membrane. The posterior part is soft because it is formed of muscles, glands, and covered by mucous membrane. The middle part of the soft palate hangs downwards, is called the uvula. So this is the hard palate, soft palate, uvula. This is the dorsum of the tongue, and there is a cavity at the back of the oral cavity. This is called the pharynx. On both sides of the pharynx there is a lymphoid collection, number 6. This is called the palatine tonsil. In front of the tonsil there is a fold and another one at the back. The front one, number 5, it comes from the palate to the tongue. This is called the palatoglossal fold. It contains muscle with the same name, PALATOGLOSSUS muscle. The fold at the back, it comes from the soft palate to the pharynx behind. This is called the palatopharyngeal fold. It encloses a muscle, palatopharyngeus muscle. The hard palate is formed of two bones, maxilla and palatine bone. There is a suture between the two maxillae, intermaxillary suture, interpalatine suture, maxillopalatine suture. This part of the maxilla is called the palatine process of the maxilla. This part of the palatine bone is called the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. There is a fossa in front. This is called the incisive fossa or incisive foramen. Also, there is the greater palatine foramen, and behind there are small, lesser palatine foramina. The posterior border of the hard palate, this is called palatine crest. This projection is called the posterior nasal spine. From this crest there is a white fibrous tissue passing backwards here, in which all the muscles are attached. This is called the palatine aponeurosis. So all the muscles are attached to the palatine crest and the palatine aponeurosis. One muscle, which is in the uvula, musculus spine. This is the hard palate, soft palate, this maxilla, palatine bone, palatine crest, posterior nasal spine. This is the palatine aponeurosis in which the muscles are attached. You can see here, this is the incisive foramen, this is the greater palatine foramen, lesser palatine foramina. Also you can see the nerves. This is the greater palatine nerve. It doesn't pass all through to the end. anteriorly. It passes only to here. And there is another nerve which comes from the nasal cavity, which is called the nasopalatine nerve. It descends through this foramen to the palate. It supplies the mucous membrane of the anterior part, while this nerve, greater palatine, supplies the mucous membrane of this part of the hard palate. Also, from the greater palatine foramen, there is the artery, greater palatine artery, which passes in a groove here till it passes through the incisive foramen to supply also part of the nasal cavity. It shares in an anastomosis in the nasal septum. The lesser palatine foramina, you are going to see the lesser palatine nerves supplying the soft palate and the lesser palatine arteries supplying also the soft palate. So, to make it easy, the hard palate is supplied by greater palatine nerves and vessels, while the soft palate receives the lesser palatine nerves and vessels. The soft palate is formed of 5 muscles: levator palati, tensor palati. These two, they come from the base of the skull downwards to be inserted into the palate. And we said before, the muscles are attached to which part of the palate? Palatine crest and palatine aponeurosis. From the name of the muscle, you can know the action of the muscle. Levator palati means it elevates the palate. Tensor palati mean it tenses the palate. مشدودة، تتشد، تبقى مفرودة. ال 2 other muscles اللي بعد كده palatoglossus and palatopharyngeus، دول they come from the palate downwards. يبقى الأولين coming from the base of the skull للبالات، عشان كده الانسرشن بتاعهم في البالات. أما الاتنين اللي بعد كده they originate from the palate and they insert into other places below the palate. So the palatoglossus from the palate to the tongue, and the palatopharyngeus from the palate to the pharynx. The last one, which is called musculus uvuli, it is present only in the uvula. So it is present in the middle part of the soft palate. So it originates from the posterior nasal spine, which is in the middle part of the palatine crest. And this muscle is very short. It is inserted into the covering mucous membrane. So when it contracts, it shortens the uvula. Here is a diagram summarizing the muscles. We have 2 muscles coming from the base of the skull to the palate, and we have 2 other muscles coming from the palate to the tongue and the pharynx, and there is the musculus uvuli in the middle part. All the muscles are attached to the palatine crest and palatine aponeurosis. What is the palatine crest? Palatine crest is the posterior border of the hard palate. Palatine aponeurosis is a fibrous tissue sheet attached to the palatine crest. يعني ايه الكلام ده؟ palatine crest البوردر الوراني بتاع الهارد بالات. palatine aponeurosis عبارة عن fibrous tissue مبطط وشابك في البالاتين كريست، وكل العضلات شابكة في الحاجتين دول. في حاجة تانية كمان مهمة جدا، ان كل الماسلز دي ليها نيرف سبلاي واحد مع واحدة ليها exception، يعني كلهم بالكرينيال part of accessory except التنسور palatine. وخدوا بالكم تنسور palatine muscle جت سيرتها قبل كده واحنا بنذاكر mandibular nerve، يعني nerve supply mandibular. أني حتة من mandibular؟ ارجعوا للmandibular nerve وقروه، هتفتكروا ان the trunk of the mandibular nerve بيدي branch to the medial tragoid. This branch passes through the otic ganglion without relay and ends by giving the tensor palati and the tensor tympani muscles. So, all the muscles of the palate are supplied by cranial part of accessory اللي هو number 11 cranial nerve, except the tensor palati which is supplied by the mandibular nerve. Here is another diagram showing the hard palate. This is the soft palate and the uvula. These are the muscles, and the whitish part here is the aponeurosis. Also there are some glands here below, underneath the mucous membrane. This is the oral cavity. This is the tongue. This is the nasal cavity. So the palate separates the oral cavity downwards from the nasal cavity upwards. Also, here is another cavity which is very important. This is the pharynx. The pharynx is a tube behind the nasal cavity, oral cavity, and larynx. It is separated from the oral cavity by this fold. You can see this fold here in front of the palatine tonsil. This fold, it comes from the palate to the tongue. This is called the palatoglossal fold. There is another fold here from the palate to the pharynx, palatopharyngeal fold. In this region here, the upper part of the pharynx, there is a tube here. This is the opening of a tube which is called Eustachian tube. Eustachian tube. This tube opens into the pharynx from one side and into the middle ear cavity on the other side. If we remove the mucous membrane, you are going to see muscles here. You are going to see tensor palati and levator palati. We are going to see here, if we remove the mucous membrane and the tonsil, you are going to see a muscle here and another one here. This is called the palatoglossus muscle, and the one at the back, palatopharyngeus muscle. This is the soft palate. This is the hard palate. This white region, this is called the aponeurosis, palatine aponeurosis. This is the palatine crest. This is the Eustachian tube, the bluish region here. This is the site of the tonsil. The muscle in front, palatoglossus muscle, the muscle at the back from the palate to the pharynx, palatopharyngeus muscle, the muscle coming from the Eustachian tube to the palate. It elevates the palate upwards like this. It's called the levator palati. There is another one which is a small part of it here. This is called the tensor palati, but we are going to see it in another figure much clearer. This is a revision for what we have seen. This is the hard palate. This is the soft palate. This is the Eustachian tube. This is the muscle coming from the Eustachian tube to the palate. This is called levator palati. This is the site of the palatine tonsil. Muscle in front to the tongue, palatoglossus muscle, and the muscle at the back to the pharynx. This is called the palatopharyngeus muscle. And look here, you will find this muscle is attached to the wall of the pharynx and also to the thyroid cartilage. You know, the thyroid cartilage which is forming تفاحة آدم بالعربي. This is called the thyroid cartilage. So where is the palatoglossus muscle? It comes from the palate to the tongue. This is the one. Which one is the palatopharyngeus? It comes from the palate to the pharynx, which comes here to the pharynx. Which is the levator palati? Levator palati comes from the Eustachian tube to the palate. So if I tell you what is the attachment of the palatoglossus muscle here, it originates from the palatine crest and palatine aponeurosis، لأن احنا قلنا كلهم شابكين في البالاتين كريست والبالاتين aponeurosis. اللي جايين من فوق من البيز اوف ذا سكال يبقى ده الانسرشن بتاعهم، اللي جايين من البالات لتحت يبقى ده الاوريجين بتاعهم. يبقى البالاتوجلوسس originates from the palatine crest and palatine aponeurosis inserted into the tongue. Which part of the tongue? Posterior lateral part of the tongue. طب المصل دي تفتكر تعمل ايه؟ تشد التونج لفوق او تنزل البالات لتحت. وكمان الحتة دي ده الفرق بين الاورال كافيتي قدام والفارنكس ورا. يبقى هي لما بتعمل contraction بتضيق المسافة اللي بين الاورال كافيتي and the pharynx, what we call the oropharyngeal isthmus. What about the palatopharyngeus muscle from this diagram? It comes from the palatine crest, palatine aponeurosis, insertion into the wall of the pharynx and the thyroid cartilage. The action elevates the wall of the pharynx and the thyroid cartilage upwards. What about the levator palati muscle? The origin is the Eustachian tube, insertion into the palate, which part palatine crest and palatine aponeurosis. So what is the action of this muscle? It elevates the soft. This is a resume of the palatoglossus muscle. Palatoglossus, from the palate to the tongue. So the origin is the palate. Which part of the palate? Palatine crest and palatine aponeurosis. Which part of the tongue? Posterior lateral part of the tongue. What is the nerve supply? احنا فاكرين ان كلهم بالكرينيال part of accessory except واحدة اللي هي انهي؟ tensor. tensor تبع المانdibular. يبقى cranial part of accessory. What is the action? Depresses the palate, elevates the tongue, narrows the oropharyngeal isthmus. Palatopharyngeus muscle. What is the origin? Palatine crest, palatine aponeurosis. الانسرشن احنا قلنا في الwall of the pharynx with thyroid cartilage. Nerve supply برضو cranial part of accessory. Action elevates thyroid cartilage and wall of the pharynx upwards. تعمل لهم elevation during deglutition. في أثناء البلع لازم يحصل الكونتراكشن دي عشان البولس of food تنزل لتحت. المسلز دول عرفناهم. palatoglossus ودي palatopharyngeus. نيجي levator palatine. Origin from the Eustachian tube. Insertion palatine crest and palatine aponeurosis. Nerve supply cranial part of accessory. Action elevates the soft palate. يبقى tensor palatine. Origin scaphoid fossa and spine of sphenoid. Insertion palatine crest and palatine aponeurosis. Nerve supply الوحيدة تبع المانdibular nerve. What is the action? Tenses the soft palate. الحاجة الغريبة على المسل دي إن هي ليها tendon which turns around the tragoid hamulus, and this is very important. The origin of the tensor palatine muscle. The tensor palatine takes origin from two parts in the base of the skull. The first one is the spine of the sphenoid. This is the spine of the sphenoid, which is behind the foramen spinosum. It is the posterior part of the sphenoid bone. This is the sphenoid bone in yellow color, and this is the spine of sphenoid. It's a projection downwards from the base of the skull. The first part is the spine of sphenoid. Also, the tensor palatine takes origin from the scaphoid fossa. This is the scaphoid fossa. It is oval-shaped depression just medial to the foramen ovale. And please try to study the tensor palatine. The tendon of the tensor palatine is this greenish part which winds around the tragoid hamulus. So it takes origin from the base of the skull, it winds around the tragoid hamulus to be inserted into the palate. Which part of the palate? The palatine aponeurosis and the palatine crest. What is the tragoid hamulus? The tragoid hamulus is the lower part of the medial tragoid plate. The last muscle is the musculus uvuli. دي موجودة في النص بالظبط ونازلة كده من هنا. فالأوريجين بتاعها from the posterior nasal spine والinsertion في mucous membrane covering the uvula. Nerve supply برضو cranial part of accessory. وطبعا when it contracts بتسحب الميوكس ممبرين ناحية posterior nasal spine فبتعمل shortening of the uvula. What is the nerve supply of the soft palate؟ احنا كنا شفنا رسمة قبل كده فيها الفورامينا الموجودة في السوفت بالات والهارد بالات وشفنا ايه اللي بيغذيهم، بس احنا هنقسم النيرف سبلاي عشان يبقى منظمين شوية الى موتور وسنسوري وسكريتو موتور. موتور يعني they supply the muscles. sensory اللي هو nerve supply of the mucous membrane، الإحساس بتاع الميوكس membrane. secreto motor اللي هي الباراسمباثيك فايبرز اللي بتروح تغذي الجلانز، لأن احنا قلنا السوفت بالات فيها عضلات وفيها جلانز and covered by mucous membrane، يبقى لازم الجلانز دي يجيلها باراسمباثيك عشان تقدر تفرز اللعاب بتاعها. يبقى في جلانز هنا موجودة فين؟ في السوفت بالات. الموتور سبلاي احنا قلنا قبل كده كل المسلز of the palate are supplied by cranial part of accessory except the tensor palati which is supplied by the mandibular nerve. ده الموتور. يبقى عندي الموتور في حاجتين cranial part of accessory و mandibular nerve. cranial part of accessory supplies which muscles؟ نعدهم من الأول. levator palati، palatoglossus، palatopharyngeus، musculus uvuli. mandibular nerve بيغذي أنهي عضلة وحيدة؟ tensor palati. ده الموتور. للسنسوري سبلاي، خدوا بالكم احنا لما جينا قلنا السنسوري سبلاي قلنا فيه هنا فورامين اسمه greater palatine، وهنا greater palatine بيطلع greater palatine nerve والليسر palatine nerves، وكمان في هنا نيرف تاني اسمه سفينو بالاتاين او نيزو بالاتاين. يبقى الهارد بالات الميوكس ممبرين بتاعها ايه النيرف سبلاي بتاعه؟ greater palatine، ده نقوله الاول لانه اهم، والحته القدامانيه بالنيزو بالاتاين. اما السوفت بالات في السنسيشن عن طريق الليسر بالاتاين نيرفز اللي نازلين من الخروم دي، وكمان الجزء الوراني عن طريق نيرف بتاع مين؟ بتاع الفارنكس اللي ورا اللي هو كرينيال نمرة 9 اسمه جلوسو فارنجيال نيرف. يبقى ده السنسوري سبلاي بتاع الميوكس ممبرين. فاضل عندنا السكريتو موتور فايبرز اللي هما بنسميهم باراسمباثيك. دايما السكريتو موتور او الباراسمباثيك دول فايدتهم بيروحوا للجلاند علشان to increase the production of the secretion. These fibers originate from the superior salivatory nucleus and then passes through the facial nerve, then through the greater petrosal nerve of pterygoid canal, and then relays in the sphenopalatine ganglion to the lesser palatine nerves which go to the glands of the soft palate. يبقى في الحتة دي احنا لازم نعرف حاجتين. أنهي cranial nerve carries the secretomotor fibers to these glands؟ facial nerve اللي هو cranial number 7. بيحصل الريلي in which ganglion in the sphenopalatine ganglion. The blood supply of the palate. في عندنا برضو الهارد palate عن طريق greater palatine artery, soft palate عن طريق lesser palatine arteries, and also the ascending palatine, which are branches from the facial artery. Thank you.